Welcome to Civics and Coffee, a history podcast, the show all about United States history, delivered to you in the time it takes to enjoy your morning cup of coffee. I'm your host, Alicia, a historian trained in United States history with a passion for telling both the known and unknown parts of America's past. So grab your coffee and get ready for some bite-sized history. Welcome back, peeps. New York is one of the most iconic cities in the world, a beacon of American capitalism with a complex history filled with big names and even bigger egos. And that's why I was excited to pick up Jonathan Mahler's latest book, The Gods of New York, a history of the city in the late 80s. Mahler explores how this time in New York was transformative for residents and how a few quote-unquote gods permanently altered the landscape, both physically and metaphorically. Jonathan Mahler is a staff writer for the New York Times whose journalism has received numerous awards and has been featured in the Best American Sports Writing. His best-selling Ladies and Gentlemen, The Bronx is Burning was also adapted as an ESPN miniseries. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. Hey everyone, welcome back. With me today is Jonathan Mahler. He is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine and author of several books, including Gods of New York, which will be the focus of our conversation today. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on. So let's dive right on in. This is kind of a micro history of a pretty big city. So what made you write a book about this specific period in New York's history?
Yeah, so this sort of started when back in 2016, when I was, as you mentioned, I work at the New York Times, and I was assigned to the presidential campaign in 2016, and I was part of a kind of small team of people who were not following specific candidates, but writing kind of longer, deeper stories about some of the candidates and their histories. Because I had written an earlier book about New York in the 1970s, I kind of gravitated toward Donald Trump, who was running for president for the first time back then. You know him, Donald Trump. And I did some stories about him and kind of his sort of origin stories about him in the 80s in New York. And an editor sort of / friend at Random House called me up and took me out to lunch and said, well, are you interested in writing a book about Donald Trump's kind of beginnings? And I said I was not, but that I had by then gotten interested in this period of time in New York, the 80s. And, there were kind of a few reasons why I was drawn to this period of time. I mean, one was just that there were just huge characters, just outsized characters were kind of roaming the city then, whether it is Donald Trump or Ed Koch or Al Sharpton or Rudy Giuliani or Larry Kramer, Spike Lee, all these kind of big figures. And so much happened during these years as well. So I was also kind of drawn to the events of these years. So whether that was this series of infamous racial incidents, Howard Beach, Tawana Brawley, the Central Park Five. Also, these were the years of the AIDS crisis and the crack epidemic. So it was just an eventful period of time. And it was also kind of, lastly, I would say, kind of an important period of time for New York, a seminal period of time when the city kind of was reborn after the 70s, when the city's economy had kind of been hollowed out by deindustrialization. It rebuilt itself in the 80s around Wall Street and around finance, around real estate. And the story of that rebirth and how complicated it was and how many people were left out of that rebirth was also compelling. So I came to see these years as really the beginning of modern New York. I mean, that is the city today, the city that's really driven by Wall Street and real estate.
Yeah, and the book is called The Gods of New York. And so who were these gods and what was some of their impact to the city?
Yeah, sure. So the title is kind of meant to be, kind of somewhat ironic. I'm not referring to them as Judeo-Christian gods. It's more like Greek gods. So the idea really was, or even you might say kind of tabloid gods. The idea was that these figures, and again, it's Koch, it's Sharpton, it's Trump, it's Giuliani, it's Larry Kramer. It's Spike Lee. These were figures who just had an outsized impact on the life of the city during these years, in part because the New York City tabloids turned them into such towering celebrities. So when I talk about them as gods, I mean more of the kind of Greek variety, with New York as their kind of Mount Olympus, I would say.
And so you've kind of touched on this already, but there are so many pivotal moments that you cover in this brief history, and one of those is the AIDS epidemic. So can you talk a little bit about the city's battle with the AIDS epidemic and how that kind of influenced Mayor Koch?
Yeah, I mean, the years I cover, 1986 to 1990. By this point, the AIDS crisis, had begun several years earlier, had begun really at the dawn of the 1980s, and the epidemic had now spread. It had started, of course, kind of in the gay community, but it had moved now into the homeless population, into intravenous drug users. It was really kind of spreading across the city. And it was a crisis, and it was a crisis also for Koch, because he was fixated on fixing the city's budget, on balancing the city's budget. And it was very expensive to deal with a massive health crisis like this, particularly because, over the course of the 1970s, the city had been so eager to kind of cut expenses into the early 80s that they'd closed a lot of hospitals, they'd reduced their healthcare spending. So the city was really kind of ill prepared for this moment. There was also a sense, particularly in the gay community, that Koch was deliberately downplaying the AIDS crisis, not just for financial reasons, but because he himself was gay and in the closet, and was wary of drawing more attention to his sexuality. It was really a crisis, both a social crisis for the city, and also a kind of a political crisis for Koch.
Yeah, and then this book, it jumps from just one crisis, one major event to the next, and, one of the other areas that you explore is the impact of crack cocaine. So, what was that impact to New York during this time, and kind of what was the response or lack of response?
Yeah, so crack as well kind of arrived, just really sort of shortly after AIDS. And 85 was really when crack began to spread around the city, and only got much worse from there. And it was at the time, as I kind of alluded to before, the city was going through this kind of, rebirth in quotes, because a lot of people were kind of in this new economy, were unable to get jobs, weren't able to find housing, weren't able to kind of get a foothold, because it was so oriented around the finance industry and real estate. So, along comes crack cocaine, which is kind of the perfect drug for people who are broke and desperate, because it's cheap, it's an instant, kind of transporting high that kind of erases the rest of your life. And so it spread very quickly around the city. The police department at the time was quite corrupt, and by and large not, it was also understaffed. So by and large was not kind of dealing effectively with this crisis. And it really kind of overran the city. And it was, we now talk about the kind of, the carceral state and the kind of the crisis of incarceration. I mean, a lot of that really begins during these years, because, there's nothing. The city has no resources for drug rehab or anything like that. It really, the only way that it could deal with crack was to just arrest and lock up and certainly dealing the drugs. So that just kind of exacerbated the city's problems. It also kind of exacerbated the racial tension in the city, because the drug was particularly popular inside the Black community, which was suffering disproportionately from the kind of economic transformation of the city. So the fact that, a lot of the city's like crack users, crack dealers visible on the streets were Black, only kind of made the racial tension in the city worse. Even though regular cocaine, powder cocaine, was quite popular among the upper class in Manhattan.
Well, and you talk about, kind of the economic downturn, and one of those major events during the time that you cover in this book is Black Monday. So, how did that Wall Street crash really impact and influence the city?
Yeah, so I mean, the city's economy had really been powered by this surging kind of bull market on Wall Street for years. All the bonuses that Wall Street was throwing off was the money that was being poured into new condominiums and, new hotels and into Broadway and into new restaurants. and that was generating tax revenues, the tax base for the city. So, when the stock market crashed in October of 1987, whole new economic model that the city had adopted was suddenly in jeopardy. I mean, you have to remember that in the years before the 80s, the economy was much more diverse. It was manufacturing, it was shipping. It wasn't so Wall Street centric, but it was now suddenly very Wall Street centric. The bottom sort of fell out that October, and the city was suddenly, even as it was facing these crises, surging unemployment, crime, there was suddenly a sense of we have to cut back, we have to retrench, and so it just kind of multiplied the city's problems, or sort of underscored how precarious the moment was.
Well, and you spend several hundred pages really analyzing this next question. So I'm asking this knowing full well that it's probably too large of a question to really answer in full here. And it would be one more plug for people to go pick up the book. But how did the city change in the period you review in your book?
Yeah. So, I mean, to me, this is, as the sort of subtitle suggests, this really was the beginning of modern New York. If you kind of go back in time to the post World War II period, which is kind of in modern history the kind of most significant chapter in New York's life. That was a period of time when the city was really built for the working class. There was a ton of manufacturing, shipping, very powerful labor unions, a huge working class in New York, strong public institutions, great public schools, great municipal hospitals, and powerful labor bosses who kind of took care of people, made sure that there was food on the table, they were getting what they needed, their homes were heated. So that city was really New York for many years, for decades. And what happened in the 1980s is that the new city, the modern city, was born. And what I mean by that is New York became a place that was really built for the wealthy. It's, Mayor Bloomberg would years later call it a luxury product. And I think that's a pretty good description of what New York became. And it also explains how we've reached this affordability crisis that's driving the Mamdani campaign. So to me, what happens during these years is a kind of a new reality sets in New York. And it's a sort of tense and fraught period of time because, there's still a struggle going on over what New York is going to be, what New York's identity is going to be. But during these years, this new identity becomes set. This becomes New York. And what I mean by that is New York is from now on going to be a place of the super wealthy and the kind of permanently poor. And that gap just widens over the course of the years that follow.
The book explores these quote unquote gods, and readers who maybe are not familiar with them before
Right.
2016 might be surprised to learn some of the backstories of some of the gentlemen that you cover. So how did these quote unquote gods of New York evolve during that 4-year span you cover?
Yeah, I mean, really, all of these characters, I mean, whether we're talking about Donald Trump or Rudy Giuliani or Al Sharpton, Spike Lee again, Larry Kramer, who creates ACT UP during these years, the great kind of AIDS activist group. These were the kind of crucible for these years, were the crucible for all these characters. And so, that happens in the case of Donald Trump in a variety of ways, both through his high profile kind of development projects, his effort to build new casinos in Atlantic City. These were the years when he wrote The Art of the Deal, the kind of largely fictional memoir that made him a national celebrity. In Giuliani's case, these were the years when he was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District. These were the years when he brought down the mob in New York, when he went after white-collar crime, when he went after other kind of financial criminals. And these were the years where he kind of built his reputation as a kind of crusading prosecutor that would then launch his career as mayor. Larry Kramer, these were the years, as I mentioned, when he built ACT UP, which became probably the most important activist group in modern American history, which really kind of transformed political activism. For Al Sharpton, these were the years where he went from being really kind of a nobody to a sort of famous figure in New York, and then even a national figure because he attached himself to these various racial controversies and became a kind of a modern day civil rights leader who kind of promoted his cases in the tabloids. Held noisy protests, often in white neighborhoods. And for Spike Lee, these were the years where he went from being really a kind of largely unknown, obscure, kind of independent filmmaker into one of the most important filmmakers in American history with the making of Do the Right Thing, which was a pure kind of political and social commentary on life in New York and the racial tension in New York during this period of time.
Well, and I think one of the main themes of the book is kind of this idea of myth making. And you write about how figures like Spike Lee and Rudy Giuliani kind of cultivated their public personas during this time. So what role did the media play in amplifying or distorting these narratives?
Yeah, I mean, the media played a huge role. None of this would have been possible in today, for instance, because today in New York, we still have tabloids, the tabloid media, but people by and large don't read the tabloids. Back then, this was before the internet. This was even before cable news, really. And everyone got their news from the same few newspapers, from the Daily News, from the New York Post, from the New York Times, and from Newsday. And so if those papers were covering your story, were covering you, you were going to become a big shot. So, without without the tabloid media in particular during these years, Donald Trump would never have been able to turn himself into this kind of symbol of wealth and excess and success that he kind of became in the 1980s. Al Sharpton never would have been able to develop any kind of political power because it was the tabloids that turned him into a celebrity. He would have just been a small-time civil rights leader, political protest leader. And Giuliani too, he promoted all of his cases in the tabloids. He tried to draw as much attention to all of his prosecutions as possible. Generally, the U.S. attorney for the Southern District is a kind of a nobody in New York, but Giuliani really kind of turned that on its head. So really, it was this particular moment in time, the kind of nature of the media at this moment in time, which was just before the dawn of cable news and the internet, when everyone was still reading the same newspapers, which meant that those newspapers were really driving and defining the conversation in New York. And New York was really the most important city in the country, so everyone was paying attention to what was going on in New York. That's what really kind of enabled all these figures to, become kind of gods.
Well, and we've kind of touched on it here and there in the conversation thus far, but I really want to dive into this. How does learning about this specific time in New York's history kind of help us understand our current moment?
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a very kind of important theme of the book that I try not to, I try to really just tell this book as a story. It's a narrative of 4 years that I wanted to make as kind of novelistic as I could. So I try not to, connect any dots between what's happening directly in the 1980s and today. But I think implicitly, readers will pick up on a lot of familiar themes here, and which is to say that this is where these were the years, this was the time, this was the place where Donald Trump learned how to be Donald Trump, which is to say that this is where he learned how to capture and hold the public's attention. This is where he learned how to kind of build a storyline, which he did in all sorts of ways during these years in the tabloids, really largely through the tabloids. And it was only, because the tabloids were relentlessly covering new celebrities. This was the birth of the modern gossip column, that someone like Donald Trump could even be considered worthy of coverage. And he recognized that if he could get himself covered in the tabloids day in and day out, he could build himself into a big kind of important public figure. And it almost didn't matter. It didn't matter whether the coverage was positive or negative. The point was to just get people talking about him and to build his name and to build his reputation. He also learned that because the tabloids became so sort of fixated on everything he did, even if he did something that brought him a great deal of criticism, if he just kind of kept going, it would be okay. It was essentially the birth of this kind of culture of shamelessness that drives our politics now, and that also is kind of part of the tabloid culture. You even once you're disgraced, you're still a star. So, So I think that this was the moment in time when those values, kind of shamelessness, this sense that if you act bulletproof, are bulletproof. This was the moment in time when that became when people began to recognize that that was valuable, that that could kind of drive your rise.
Well, and you've touched on the current mayoral campaign, the race in New York right now. So I am curious. I know we've kind of had this modern New York, and it was ushered in during this time period of your book. Do you think maybe we might be on a way to a different type of New York?
Yeah, I mean, I think this it's a really interesting question to think about. I mean, I think there's no question that that Mamdani's campaign is really an answer to the New York that was born in the 1980s. He is really offering a vision of an existentially different city, a city that is again built around the working class or the middle class, people who have been kind of driven out of the conversation in New York. And there's no question that that is what he's promising. That's what his vision is kind of intended to underscore and to prioritize. The question I think is whether this is kind of practically possible at this point in history, now that the city's economy has become so dependent on the wealthy, on real estate developers, and now that the city's government has largely gotten out of the business of doing all the things that he is suggesting it will now again be able to do. So I think a big question mark kind of looms over the practical reality of his vision, but I think there's no question that what he is promising and what he's proposing is a new New York, is a new chapter in the life of New York. So if you think about the one chapter beginning with my book and the years that followed and New York, he is basically saying that he wants to transform New York, not from a luxury product back into a city for the middle class.
We'll see how it all shakes out. And so, what do you
Yeah.
hope people take away from your book?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I want people to just be entertained. I mean, this is a as we've touched on, this is a year filled with a lot of crises and a lot of tough stuff. But I think the book is fun to read because it's sort of rollicking. The characters are larger than life. So what I want most of all is for people to just not want to put the book down. Beyond that, I do think that I would love for people to come away with a kind of a new understanding of how we arrived at this political moment, sort of why the personalities and the people who are kind of looming so large in our political culture, where they came from, and what particular circumstances fed their rise. So I'm hoping that people will kind of grasp that as well. And also, I think I'm hoping that this is a little more specific for New Yorkers, but I think I'm hoping that New Yorkers will also read this book and feel a different kind of connection with the city, a different sense of there's more to New York than just its kind of geography. That there's an idea behind New York. That this is a city was designed and evolved into a place that where that was welcomed immigrants, that was intended to give them an opportunity to make a better life for themselves, and that when the city loses its kind of ability to transform people's lives, people to provide opportunity for people, then it's sort of losing its identity. And I hope that people will kind of reconnect with that idea of New York from this book as well.
Well, for someone who has family back east and is familiar with some of the most of the characters that you covered in the book, I thought it was a great new insight into learning kind of their origin stories and seeing how we kind of got to this moment. And it was also incredibly engrossing. So I
Thank
didn't want
you.
to put it down. And so where should people go when they finish your book and they want to learn more about you and the work that you do?
Yeah, well, I write. My day job is at the New York Times Magazine, so you should you can follow my work there at the New York Times. But if you enjoy this book, you should probably go back and read my first book, which is called "Ladies and Gentlemen, the Bronx is Burning," and it's about the year 1977 in New York. And in some ways, it's kind of the prequel to The Gods of New York. That was a book really about the 70s and the city kind of bottoming out with, this is you think of the movies like Taxi Driver, The Warriors, and what New York looked like in the 1970s. That's sort of the era that my first book is about. This is the next chapter. This is the rebirth of New York as the kind of glamorous, glitzy 80s. But of course, kind of beneath the surface, there was everything: AIDS, crack, crime. So, I would recommend my first book after you finish this one.
And is there anything we haven't covered today that you want future readers to know?
That was pretty good. We covered a lot of ground. Thank you.
Okay. And so for all the listeners out there, I highly recommend picking up a copy of The Gods of New York. Jonathan weaves a fast-paced, engrossing story that you will not want to put down. It's a book that helps provide context for our current moment and should definitely be added to your reading list. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thanks so much for having me, Alicia.
My thanks again to Jonathan for coming and sharing his work with me. If you want to pick up a copy of his book and support independent bookstores, consider purchasing a copy through my bookshop.org store or wherever fine books are sold. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next time. Thanks for sitting down with me as I explored this chapter of American history. If you liked what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.